And we're back.
Hey guys, we're back. I'm HD.
I'm Team Jonathan.
And this is our podcast, Coffee and Cold Ones, where we talk about things that you would talk about over coffee or a cold one, with a twist on counseling subjects. So, last time we talked about, what did we talk about last time?
Counselors are people too.
Counselors are people too. So now we're going to talk about how we navigate some insecurities through the profession. So, since we've already established we are people too, we have to know how to deal with some of the insecurities, some of the things that we may not feel as equipped to deal with or handle. And how do you deal with that professionally?
So, maybe let's start with, what would you say were your first insecurities, like when you got into the field?
Not knowing what I'm doing. Like, a client just blah, and you're like, oh gosh, I don't even know. I mean, you have your reflective questioning and your reframing statements or whatever, but then I'm like, I don't know. Like,
right.
Like everybody's so different, and everybody takes what you say in a different way or interprets what you say in a different way, and you're just like, where do I go from here? Like, or you get to a good place, but then you're like, okay, and then?
Right.
So.
Well, and like, I think mine were, dealing with a quiet client.
Oh, yeah.
Is, or even, a lot of my early sessions were with kids, and especially in the jail system, and you're going to have at least one of those, they already don't really want to talk to you anyways. And so, like, not that you can't be productive, but I think dealing with that, like this kid is just staring at me.
Yeah. Well,
anything.
and those kids, it takes longer to build that rapport. So
Mm-hmm.
I played a lot of cards. I mean, you'd probably, for 8 weeks, play cards, and then they start talking to you, and you're like, okay, like, now we can start making progress. But yeah, that sometimes can be very discouraging, because you're like, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to get them to talk to me. Is it me that they don't want to talk to, or they just don't want to talk in general? So yeah.
And it's a very discouraging feeling, because it's like you're trying to learn, and you don't even, like, when you're training, they tell you to be comfortable with silence, and I think it's probably the most undersold, underrated. Like, it's very uncomfortable. Like, and especially when, back to the last episode, we talked about counselors are people too, and sometimes held at a higher standard, is you're not expected to have those problems. You know what I mean? Like, if a kid is having trouble, or a client, and people referring to you, they expect you to be able to just automatically fix it.
Yeah. So you asked me what my insecurity was starting out. So just not knowing what I'm doing. I would say now, I work in a school setting. I have my own private practice. I think what my insecurity is now is, you meet with a student 4 times and they're still having issues, and it's like, well, they've been meeting with the counselor, like, why are they still having these issues? And so that can be very discouraging and make me feel like, well, maybe I haven't been doing a good job. Well, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. Like, without considering, like, you don't know everything that is going on outside of what that client is telling you. So, like,
right.
If they're not sharing certain things with me, I can't work on those things with them if they're not talking about it to me. Or if they have a bad day, like, we're just like we said, counselors are people too. Our clients are going to have bad days. One bad day, one meltdown shouldn't discredit your past sessions or any past work that you've done with them, because that is part of the process. Like, I have clients that say, there's a certain behavior that I don't like doing. Oh, well, I screwed up. I fell to the pressure of doing whatever behavior, but that's part of that process of getting over that and doing that work. And it doesn't mean that my past sessions with them are just out the window down the toilet. It means that there's still work to be done, obviously, but if they're at a point where they're still reaching out and talking to other people about whatever's going on, like, I think that's a good thing. Like, if they're reaching out to their friends, oh, I'm having a bad day, like, that should be a win. Because they didn't even have to tell you, their friend, that they were having a bad day.
Exactly. And I think it gets really challenging when you're working with students or, you know, people under 18, because you have, because when you have somebody under 18, right, you kind of almost have, you really have two clients, the parent and the minor, right? And I may, you know, I've worked with some very troubled kids in the counseling, you know, arena, and they may perform behaviorally better for me than they may in front of their parent.
Right.
And we could work on stuff, or even I think sometimes the challenge with some of them, I've dealt with the parent's really the problem, or the parent makes the problem with the student even worse. And so it's like, I can't outright say, hey, because, you know, I'm not doing family counseling with them, you know.
Right.
And again, it's the same thing as you're expected to be able to fix it overnight. And I'm like, behaviorally, yeah, sure, we could work on some things, but you know, when you kind of have this audience, this other person involved, you know, it can feel like, okay, you're not doing a good job because, oh, kid blew up on mom, right? You know, and I think sometimes people can forget, like, you know, some of these problems, they've been persistent for years, right? Or their environment is, you know.
Right.
And it can be very discouraging sometimes that, you know, well, you know, back to the last episode we did, it's like, you can expect yourself to be able to be perfect.
So, and then, you know, we can't expect ourselves to be perfect. People who are trained in this field and, you know, have all this knowledge and education, and we expect a kid to meet with a counselor 4 times, and, you know, the whole 13 years of their life that has not been a good situation is just supposed to go away, and they're just supposed to be fine. And that's not the case. Like, you know, even as adults, like, it takes a long time, not a long time, but it takes some work, some active participation on your own to rewire some of your thoughts and change some of your behaviors. So it's very unrealistic to say, well, they've been meeting with the counselor, oh, but they're still having issues, so the counselor must not be a good counselor. And me being in a small town, that's a big insecurity of mine, because that is my identity in that town. Like, so, that's mine.
No, but it's true, though. And it's, you know, we know from a clinical standpoint that the counselor and patient alliance is a key component in change, right? But we also know that clients, you know, sometimes they counselor shop. Sometimes you're not the counselor for them, or maybe you were, and they're moving on to something else where maybe a different counselor would be better, right? We know that in a clinical, and we know that intellectually, but we don't ever think of it like for that it applies to us sometimes, you know, and or that it's a commentary on your skill. But the clients I've worked with, or patients I've worked with that have been successful, it's because they chose to be. You know what I mean? And we know that. You know, you can only take them so far as they want to go. But even like patients or clients I have that are kind of in what we call the maintenance stage, which means like not really doing heavy stuff. They kind of got it going, but it's just, you know, keeping their eye on the ball type setting, you know. But I've had some of them, you know, they're doing great, and then bam, panic attack happens, or death in the family, bam. And we know clinically that people, they're going to fall back on what they know how to do, or what they've done for years. And that's
worked before.
Exactly. Even though they have all these other techniques, sometimes that's what they'll do.
Yeah. But it has nothing to do with, oh, well, you're just a bad counselor. Has nothing to do with that. Yeah.
And that it's something we intellectually know, but again, back to the last episode we did, is we forget that we're human and they're human.
And it's easy to be hard on ourselves. And sometimes I'm like, I wish this client would just get it together, but I have to give them grace just like I have to give myself grace.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's sometimes we forget what we already know, and a counselor in their truest state is really just a facilitator. All you're doing is facilitating change, right? But change, and it's something I tell my patients, but sometimes it's hard for me to believe for myself. It's like growth isn't just all, it's all over the place. And I think if we can accept and believe that, we will put less pressure on us, because I think I think this is a career thing. It's like when people pick a career, like you don't ever pick a career thinking you're gonna struggle or not be the best. Like you pick it because you think you will be good, right? And especially in the helping fields or performance-based fields, like we think we won't ever struggle, but it's kind of dumb to think that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just in any profession, that like kids, when I worked with at the high school level, they would pick up a skill or pick up something and, oh, well, I don't want to do that, it's too hard. And like you have to go through the struggles. And so on the outside looking in, like it's easy to have that mindset, but whenever it's you that it's on, it's hard to remember that and think, okay, yeah, I am going to have hard days, but I have to work through it. I have to work through these insecurities. I have to figure out what is going to work, what is going to be better, what's going to make me better. But it's easier to see that when you look at somebody else than when you're having to look at you.
Right. I'll even throw one out there. Asking for help.
Yeah.
I've gotten better at it lately, but I think it's actually the agency I work for. They're just very, they're so happy to help you. There's so much of a culture of support and community, and they actively do that. But I can tell you, I mean, again, something I mentioned in the last video is the counseling world. I mean, I guess it's probably the same with a lot of industries. Can be very exploitive, and it can be to the point where you can feel insecure. Well, we even talked about in the last video, just taking time off, but let alone asking for help. Like when we be in the jail setting, like you need at least 2 or 3 staff members to help you out to do anything. And sometimes they maybe, what if they're having a bad day and got an attitude, or, we even found like there's certain staff members we'd want to work with and ones we wouldn't.
Well, and then it's kind of hard in my situation where I'm the only one who does what I do where I work. And so like, who do I go to? And then so I try to go to certain people, and they're helpful to their extent, but they don't have that full understanding or that full knowledge. And so then it's like, well, who do I go to?
Well, and even like you mentioned earlier but then it's followed up with judgment. Like and it's
yeah.
And the challenge, I mean, I think in the counseling field is like we may, you probably see this, social workers too, is we work in sometimes so many different agency settings or whatever, that there's difference. Like the systems that the agency I work for now are different than the systems that in the jail, or different from the schools. And even within school systems, right, not every ISD does something the exact same. And so you need to ask help, just because sometimes you don't.
Well, yeah, it's like, okay, I know the law, I know the rule, I know the ethics, but like, how is it done here? Especially, I mean, and I don't mean this in a bad way, this is just, I'm just saying, when you go from small town to small town to small town, there's the small town way of how things are done. I mean, they still abide by the laws and the rules and the ethics, but there's certain ways of doing things that you kind of have to learn that culture. And so it does feel like you don't know what you're doing. You go to a new town, a new school district, and you're like, okay, how do y'all do this? Like,
right.
Yeah.
And especially out here, like where there's a bunch of small towns, is like, it even sometimes comes down to the campus. Like,
Yeah.
because
Like,
even where you are, like the middle school and the high school, they're kind of different, right? Or
Yeah. I mean, where I'm at, my campus is connected to another campus, but then there's another campus that's separate. And so it is easier for the two campuses that are connected to be very similar. And then the one that's not connected, it's easier for that one to be a little bit on their own. I mean, do things their way. So.
right. And sometimes, I mean, and this is probably an aside, but like some of these places, you know, there's kind of this historical backdrop of like why certain things are done a certain way.
Well, they've always done it a certain way, and that's that's why it's the way it is, because we've always done it this way. There's no reason to change it, which is fine, but it's frustrating when you're trying to learn. And not everybody always wants to teach you either.
Right. And I mean, I've lucked out in, you know, one of the schools I was at, you know, the counselor, right? And I knew from a different job I worked at. So, I mean, I had an in and a way to communicate with her, and she could understand my situation, right? But I've also worked ones where, like, it very much wasn't that, you know, and you don't realize how much. I mean, you could probably share from your experience. Like, there's so many situations I've been in. I had to figure out how to make it work for myself because there wasn't somebody to ask for help, which, as a therapist, you shouldn't ever be in that. You don't want to be. I mean, because like that's whole part of they call the ethical decision making model is you got to be able to ask for help.
Well, and then the way we make decisions, it's very foundational. So we come from a foundation. We have the ethical decision making model. You have to have a theoretical framework. You have to have a foundation of where you're coming from when you're making these decisions. But when there's not that established in a place where you work, it's really hard to ask for help, or you're given an answer, but the answer will change depending on who you ask. What mood they're in,
right?
What other stressful things are going on that day, which is not how it should be. Like, you have to have that framework. I mean, it is so important. And if you want to operate on this is the way we've done it, this is how we've always done it, we're not going to change, that's fine. But you have to have a protocol. Like, this is what we do. It can't just be willy-nilly, whatever.
And that's why I think as a counselor, and this is something like if I could I mean, I like the experiences I've had because it's made me really good at what I do. But, and this goes back to, it was a few ago, we talked kind of about mentors and supervisors. I think, especially those of you that may be coming up to be counselors, or maybe already are, be very discerning about where you work and who you work with,
and don't allow other people's negativity or their own insecurities or their unethical
She's making up words today.
Unethical behaviors affect how you operate as a counselor, or how you form your perception on certain areas of work or certain clients or certain topics. I mean, like, because I think I've fallen into that too, is I've allowed other people's poor judgment or their own insecurities, I've allowed it to form within myself, where I now have a bad insecurity or a bad perception on something. And if you use that discernment ahead of time, you'll kind of avoid some of that.
Right. And it's not something I think your average supervisor will tell you. Because, like, when you're first starting out, like, you're just looking for a site, you're just looking for hours, which is a good thing in that you want to get your license, you want to get your hours, but, like, you could, like, these are all things we're talking about from, like, experiences. Like, I didn't know, because sometimes, like, you're in an environment, like, certain agencies are just very toxic, or their directors are toxic, or, and you can and then that can increase that insecurity of asking for help, and you don't know that the environment doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah.
Is certain organizations have a culture, or even communities,
Yeah.
is like, yes, it was always done in this community this way, but it may not have been done for that way for good reasons.
Yeah.
And I think especially like in small town settings, you don't necessarily have as much power to fight back against
Yeah.
those things. Even though we're supposed to be advocates, you don't realize, especially in small towns, that's a harder monster
Yeah.
to fight than I think in places with more amount of resources.
Yeah. Which I think is maybe another insecurity. I didn't think about it this way until you just said that, but another insecurity of mine probably currently is, well, do I even matter? Like I'm trying to make these positive changes. I'm trying to do things.
Matter.
I'm trying to do things the right way, and you're fighting against, well, we've always done it this way. We don't want to change. And so you're kind of like, well, do I even matter? Like, nobody's coming to me for my opinion. So does my opinion even matter? Does what I think and my vision for this campus or this district, like, is it even valuable? But so don't get caught into that trap, because the work you do does matter.
It does matter.
It does matter.
And you matter, and it's like, and that's where I think some of these insecurities can grow, is like you may not even have this insecurity until you're starting to get into the field.
Yeah.
And it can kind of paint, and that's why, in the teaching field, why some teachers don't last, or in the mental health field, why some counselors don't last, is it's not so much that the problems of clients or patients, it's sometimes it's like, you're working at a job and it's so frustrating there that you think every place is like that.
Yeah.
And that it's just not the case. And I wish, and again, that's why be very discerning about who your supervisors are, who or where you're going to work, because, again, like our last video, like, you are important, and I can lose sight of that importance if I'm in an environment that's toxic, and maybe there's one down the street that's actually better for you.
Yeah. Well, and to go back to that, like, don't get caught up in I just need my hours. Like, because I think it's really easy to get caught up in, you're just collecting hours, you're not even learning anything. Because I've actually had counseling students come to me wanting hours, and it's like, I'm trying to actually teach them and help them grow and help them learn, and they have no desire to sometimes learn. And I don't know, just you get caught up in just wanting hours, and it's like don't fall into that trap, because okay, yeah, you have all these hours, but you didn't really learn anything, or you weren't on a good site, you didn't have a good supervisor. And so just really trying to communicate that to up-and-coming counselors is, there's value in what you're learning in your hours. It doesn't need to be turned into a checklist. Like,
exactly, and I think that's where obviously you're seeing that right now, but like there's certain counselors I won't work with, because either A, they were chasing their hours, but it's like, you can't lose sight of the fact that, like, when we're in this field, you're dealing with people's lives, and something bad can happen, just in the same vein as a doctor, right? Something bad can really happen, and you don't want to lose sight of that. And that's where, like, for me, my approach was, I wanted to develop skills. I wanted to get experience, so I've worked with so many different populations that there's not too many that I can't sit in front of and try and do something with, but if I could redo it, I wish I could have maybe been more discerning about who I worked with, or the where, because you shouldn't hate what you're doing, and you shouldn't, because I have seen some supervisors that do more of a hands-on approach.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of some of these insecurities can develop, is when you're not in an environment or connected with people that do support you.
Yeah. They just expect you to know what you're doing, which is great. But what happens when I don't know what I'm doing? Like,
Exactly.
who do I go to? And now all of a sudden, you're just a bad counselor because you didn't know how to handle that situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a class I've taken that, again, like with you being in the school, like these different systems that you're under, and it could be exploitive, or there could be bad people within those systems, and you don't know how necessarily to swim with it, you know? And it's, you know, it can give birth to that insecurity, you know, and it takes away, you know, it takes away from like what you're there to do.
Yeah.
But you do matter.
You do matter. Your work matters. But
Exactly.
take care of you. Take care of yourself. Don't let other people's insecurities create insecurities within you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we already have enough that we create in our own minds to be insecure about. Don't let other people project theirs onto you.
Exactly. And
Thanks for joining us. Join us next time on Coffee and Cold Ones.
give us a follow, subscribe, share. Peace.
Mind on the promise to our soul. If we search, we will find.
Storms clapped and I lost my sight.